Bronze Age collapse is a fascinating episode of human history. Sometime around 1200 BC, the large, complex societies of the Bronze Age seemed to vanish into nothing, virtually overnight. But this isn't the first Bronze Age collapse. 1,000 years earlier, another collapse episode swept across the Near East that is both less well known and not often connected together as an episode of collapse. So, what happened in 2200 BC? And why did the early states of the Bronze Age disappear? Let's dig in. The Bronze Age began sometime around 3300 BC, and this roughly corresponds with the rise of the dynastic city-states of Sumer. It saw the first Eblaite and Meroite kingdoms and the beginning of occupation at Khantna and Syria. In Egypt, this was the Naqada III or proto-dynastic period. In the Southern Levant, large urban centers appeared at sites like Bab el-Dra, Arad, Jericho, Yarmouth, Tel Sayyidiya, Pella, Bet Yerach, Ai, Megiddo, and Hatzor. The fortification walls at Yarmouth measure up to 40 meters thick at points. In Anatolia, the early Bronze Age saw the rise of the Hattian kingdoms, distinguished from the Hittites who would later absorb the Hattian population. The Hattians spoke a distinct language, neither Indo-European like the Hittites or Semitic like Akkadian. The Aegean too saw an increase in settlements in what is called the early Helladic period. These were the first steps in Near Eastern urban civilization. The early Bronze Age saw the increased development of trade, literacy, urbanism, metallurgy, the beginnings of mathematics and astronomy, and increases in social complexity leading to social stratification and the development of the state and even early empires. But this trend of development was not unbroken. Sometime around 2200 BC, a several-century-long period of collapse began. In the period between 2200 and 2000 or 1900 BC is technically known, at least in Levantine archaeology, as Early South Levantine 6. But most scholars nowadays refer to this period of collapse as the Intermediate Bronze Age. Now let's be clear about what we mean by collapse. We use Joseph Tainter's definition that collapse is the rapid, significant loss of an established level of socio-political complexity. And while many scholars of this period suggest what happens after 2200 is not exactly collapse, but reorganization or just post-urban, we think this qualifies as collapse given the definition we're starting from. For example, Egypt enters what is called the First Intermediate Period around 2180 BC, ending with the reunification of Egypt at the end of the 11th dynasty around 2040 BC. This period is characterized by division and disorder. Multiple dynasties of pharaohs claimed control over Upper and Lower Egypt, but none was able to actually exert control over the United Kingdom. The annual floods had been lower than usual, which led to decreased agricultural output and subsequent economic troubles. Some sources indicate episodes of famine and disease struck. Life was generally poor for Egyptians during this period. One text dated to this time called A Dispute of a Man with His Ba makes clear how harsh conditions were. The narrative is cast as an argument between a man and his ba. That is, a person's personal spiritual essence or element of their being, maybe something like their soul. And he's contemplating ending his life and finally being rid of the evil of this world because surely the afterlife has justice. The distraught narrator bemoans,
"Whom can I trust today? One's brothers have become evil and friends of today have no compassion. Whom can I trust today? Hearts are greedy, and every man steals his neighbor's goods. Kindness has vanished, and rudeness has descended upon everyone. Whom can I trust today? There are no righteous men, and the land is abandoned over to the lawless. Whom can I trust today? The evil that scourges the earth is without end. Death is in my sight today, a cure of a sick man, like going outside after confinement. Death is in my sight today, like a man's longing to see home after he has spent many years in captivity. But surely he who is there is a living God, having purged away the evil which had afflicted him. Surely he who is there stands in a bark. Surely he who is there will be one who knows all things, who will not be prevented from standing in the presence of Ra when he speaks."
The themes of justice and right living dominate the literature of this period in Egypt and even of the subsequent Middle Kingdom as they reflect on this period. Texts like The Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, The Instruction of King Merakare, The Admonitions of Epur all emphasize the importance of justice, or ma'at, to a functioning society, with the reader left to assume what we call the First Intermediate Period, lacked these virtues. One notable feature of this period was the so-called democratization of religion in the afterlife. Whereas in the Old Kingdom, only the elites, particularly the pharaoh, had elaborate tombs and the means to preserve their bodies through mummification, this shifts in the First Intermediate Period. While the preparations for the afterlife remained expensive, they became much more accessible to a larger element of the population. It has been argued that this attests to a period when the boundaries between elite and commoner were in flux, and the previously impenetrable economic barrier to partaking in standard mortuary rituals was suddenly permeable, allowing more individuals to assert elite status by participating in mortuary customs. The declining authority of the state and the attendant decline in taxation no doubt helped more people find a desirable afterlife. Egypt wasn't the only place that suffered around the year 2200, though. The Levantine coast saw major disruptions after the Early Bronze Age 3 or EB3 period. The subsequent EB4 or Intermediate Bronze Age saw a major shift in settlement patterns. Now, this culture didn't produce any literature of its own, but the archaeological picture is stark. Virtually every single site with EB3 occupation, even ones which would be occupied in the Middle Bronze Age, experienced some kind of occupational hiatus or disruption at the end of the EB3. The large fortified cities are destroyed or abandoned. Settlements move to the ecologically marginal zones. There are no more cities. Instead, modest villages and hamlets dot the landscape. Numerous new cemetery sites appear, often without an associated settlement, suggesting many formerly sedentarized populations adopted a semi-nomadic lifestyle, with some small villages and cemeteries catering to those with the newly adopted nomadic way of being. Many of the settlements are single-phase occupations and often have flimsy architecture attesting to the impermanent nature of the community. The material culture indicates distinct regionalism. The only real long-distance trade was in metal objects, particularly raw copper. It's likely this was facilitated by semi-nomadic populations as they moved through the river valleys in seasonal transhumance patterns. Population estimates for the preceding EB3 period in the Southern Levant go as high as 150,000. Whereas the Intermediate Bronze Age is ballparked around 10 to 15,000. In general, the Intermediate Bronze Age in the Southern Levant in particular looks like a period of intentional de-urbanization where local kinship ties and familial authority structures dominated society. The Northern Levant, Syria and Lebanon, had a slightly different experience. In the Khabur Valley, the Akkadian Empire struggled to remain in the area. While they built large grain storage centers at Tel Brak, this was eventually abandoned, as were other administrative buildings on the site. Tel Elan even has a building known to archaeologists as the Unfinished Building, which, as the name suggests, was begun by the Akkadians but abandoned around 2200 before it could be finished. Regional survey around Tel Elan indicates a population decline of up to 87% following the withdrawal of the Akkadian imperial outposts, suggesting the withdrawal from the Khabur Valley was not just the Akkadians, but also by large amounts of the indigenous population as well. The Euphrates and the Orontes rivers had a different experience. After being destroyed by the Akkadians, Mari was rebuilt and a new ruling dynasty took over the city. While it may not have prospered, the Third Meroitic Kingdom survived during the Intermediate Bronze Age, especially after gaining its independence following the end of the Akkadian Empire. Ebla as well survived into the Intermediate Bronze Age. The traditional rival of Mari, the city of Ebla, was destroyed around 2300, burned likely by Mari, but it was rebuilt. The subsequent Second Eblaite Kingdom was more modest in scale, but its position in the Orontes Basin meant it could sustain a stable population. Inland, where dry farming was required, the population seems to have shifted away from agriculture and towards pastoralism, as evidenced by the finding of cemeteries with no contemporary settlements. The construction of the so-called Très Longue Mur during this period may have been used to demarcate Eblaite territory and to keep arable lands secure from roving bands of pastoralists. A similar picture emerges on the Orontes. Cities like Tayanat, Arkhana, and the village of Tel Arqa flourished, in part due to their locations. Cities like Ugara experienced an occupation gap during this time, and Katana flourished, being the largest urban center in the region. In Anatolia, the Hattians had thriving early Bronze Age cities. However, the noted Hittite historian Trevor Bryce notes that, by the end of this phase, perhaps around 2300, we have evidence in some regions of major and sometimes violent changes. This is so particularly in the west and the south. In these regions, there are signs of major conflagrations, and as far as we can presently determine, relatively few of the established Early Bronze II communities survived into the final phase of the Early Bronze Age. These destructions have been blamed on a number of things. The most frequent is the arrival of a new group of people speaking an Indo-European language, a group which would eventually found the Hittite kingdom. Similarly, in the Aegean, the early Helladic would undergo major changes in the early Helladic III, or roughly around 2200 BC. Sofia Vutsaki states, the southern mainland suffers a severe crisis at the end of the EH period. We witness depopulation and destruction in various sites, changes in the settlement pattern and the settlement hierarchy, the use of settlement space, mortuary practice, and material culture. So whatever the cause, the archaeology indicates major social change and points to a drastic reduction in the level of complexity established by the early Helladic II period, pointing to socio-political collapse. Though it is notable that Crete did not experience a similar crisis as the mainland did. Finally, the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia undergoes a collapse at this time as well. The empire had been founded by Sargon around 2300 and rapidly expanded to include the Semitic-speaking northern part of Mesopotamia and into Syria and the Levant, but also into the Sumerian south. The dynasty of Sargon survived until around 2150 when the kingdom finally collapsed. Several ineffectual kings in a row were unable to deal with the many problems faced by the empire. Climatic conditions may have led to famine and subsequent rebellion, which led to the dissolution of the empire. A group called the Gutians took over management of the empire after the final king of Sargon's dynasty passed. The Sumerian king list asks,
157 are the years of the dynasty of Sargon. Then who was king? Who was the king? Igigi was king. Imi was king. Nanum was king. Ilulu was king. And the four of them ruled for only 3 years.
The Gutian interlude represented a period of dramatic decline. The conditions of this period mirror those of the first intermediate period in Egypt. In a Sumerian text written after the fall of Akkad, called the Curse of Akkad, the coming of the Gutians was seen as divine punishment for Akkadian arrogance and blasphemy.
Enlil brought out of the mountains those who do not resemble other people, who are not reckoned as part of the land, the Gutians, an unbridled people with human intelligence but canine instincts and monkey's features. Because of Enlil, they stretched their arms out across the plain like a net for animals. Nothing escaped their clutches. No one left their grasp. Messengers no longer traveled the highways. The courier's boat no longer passed along the rivers. Prisoners manned the watch. Brigands occupied the highways. Those who lay down on the roof died on the roof. Those who lay down in the house were not buried. People were flailing at themselves from hunger. By the kiloyear, Enlil's great place, dogs were packed together in the silent streets. If 2 men walked there, they would be devoured by them. And if 3 men walked there, they would be devoured by them. Noses were punched, heads were smashed, noses were piled up, heads were sown like seeds. Honest people were confounded with traitors. Heroes lay dead on top of heroes. The blood of traitors ran upon the blood of honest men.
The so-called Sumerian Renaissance at Ur, or the Third Dynasty of Ur, restored a measure of stability, but it too failed after only about a century. Modern scholarship believes Mesopotamia lost as much as 60% of its population following the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. This led to a shift in the balance of power away from the historically Sumerian south to the Semitic-speaking north. So, based on the archaeological and historical evidence, it is generally accepted that there was a region-wide episode of collapse. While it was not as sudden or as chronologically limited as at the end of the Late Bronze Age, the Intermediate Bronze Age is just as significant an episode of collapse. But what happened? Why did these early states fall apart? The most common answer is the 4.2 kiloyear event. That is a significant climactic shift that led to drastic aridification of the Near East. This process began in the Atlantic Ocean with a weakening in the meridional overturning circulation, basically a weakening in the currents. This led to a decline in the moisture-rich westerly clouds, which bring seasonal rain to the eastern Mediterranean. Core samples from the Dead Sea, Gulf of Oman, Lake Van, and even Mount Kilimanjaro all point to a significant episode of climatic shift around 2200 BC, which lasted until the 3.9 kiloyear event around 1900 BC, where climatic conditions returned to more normative levels of precipitation. It is generally regarded that this was the driving force in the social changes witnessed across the Near East, or at the very least instigating a chain of events which led to the collapse. This may reasonably explain why the Euphrates and Orontes valleys comparatively prospered, because while the river levels sank, they still allowed for irrigation farming, while more marginal areas, like the Syrian steppe, could no longer be consistently farmed, leading to more pastoralism. The phenomenon of habitat tracking, or migration of populations to more suitable environments, is cited to explain sites like Mari, Ebla, and Kantna, sites with water sources that are functionally insensitive to the details of climatic conditions. Even in Egypt, the annual flooding of the Nile is important for agricultural productivity, and consistently low floods is a clear sign of the disruption of Ma'at. Egypt needs the heavy rains down in Africa. However, the climactic model is not accepted by all as the only explanation. For example, scholars ask, why did villages flourish in agriculturally marginal zones in the Southern Levant if more arid conditions led to the end of the EB3 urban world? Some scholars suggest Akkad's fall has less to do with the climate than it does with imperial policy. Akkad was forged together by military might, and no effort was made to forge a pan-Mesopotamian identification. There was no shared national identity, and there was no real effort to create one. Questions of royal legitimacy were perennially faced by rulers of Mesopotamia. It was generally accepted kingship descended from heaven on one king at a time, but each city-state always believed heaven smiled on their king, thus making resistance to non-local kings downright pious. So would Akkad have faced rebellion and decline anyways? Similarly, were the Old Kingdom pharaohs so oppressive they were just bound to fail? Whatever the causes may have been, and it seems clear the climate shifting was certainly a major contributing factor, it is clear that the subsequent Middle Bronze Age saw a significant recovery. Minoan palaces were built in Crete, the Middle Kingdom in Egypt set a high point for Egyptian art and culture, urbanism returned to the Southern Levant, the Hittite kingdom was established in Anatolia, and the Syrian cities of Mari and Aleppo dominated the lucrative trade routes through the Fertile Crescent. The Intermediate Bronze Age showcases the incredible resilience and adaptive capacity of human societies. Despite the collapse, new systems emerged, leading to new and innovative forms of social organization. However, this resilience did not shield these civilizations from future challenges. Nearly 1,000 years later, another collapse would remind us that while humans can rebuild, the forces of change are ever present.